Hello and welcome to the India Briefing. I'm Mukulika Banerjee in London and I'm joined by my co-host Pragya Tiwari in New Delhi. Today, we are asking the million-dollar question. Where is the Indian economy going? And to help us ask the right questions and to answer them, we have possibly the best person we could get for this, Arvind Subramanian, a name familiar to many following the Indian economy. He was Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India from 2014 to 2018. And Arvind has just written a book with Devesh Kapoor. It's called A Sixth of Humanity, Independent India's Development Odyssey, that should be coming out in October this year. But today we've invited Arvind firmly with his economist hat on, somebody who's been at the heart of government to help us make sense of the Indian economy.
Thank you for joining us, Arvind. What a pleasure it is to be speaking with you. I'm going to start by asking you a very foundational question. India is said to be the world's fastest growing economy. Now, for our listeners, I'm sure you've heard the term GDP. You're very familiar with it. In case you are not, it is the gross domestic product. And quite simply put, it puts a monetary value to the goods and services that are produced within a country's borders in 1 year. And when we want to see the size of an economy or how much it's growing by, we see the percentage, we calculate the percentage change in GDP year on year. Arvind, you've had some concerns in the past about how we've been estimating our GDP. Do those concerns hold, and how do you estimate the size and growth of Indian economy?
Well, firstly, I cannot estimate GDP because you require a huge amount of data, which only the Indian statistical system and apparatus can do. All I could do and we could do was to actually raise some questions about them because, things didn't add up for a number of years. So essentially, my view has been that since they changed the way GDP was calculated in 2011-12, there's been some systematic overestimation of GDP growth. And even last week, or even this week, we wrote a piece in the Business Standard where we showed up some discrepancies in the data. I think broadly, we think, and I think that GDP growth has been overestimated, much more so in some years than in others, but a systematic pattern of overestimation. I cannot give you a counter number because, I have no basis to do that. So therefore, whether India is the fastest growing economy or not is not something that I would certainly say in public, because I just don't have the confidence to kind of confirm the official number. I do think it's lower than what the government is claiming. I think India it's been chugging along reasonably. But nothing close to the kind of gangbuster growth rates that the government has been claiming. In fact, I would say if you take the last 3 years, the growth numbers have been 7.2, 8, and 9. And if someone were to come and give me these numbers for any economy anywhere in the world at any point in time, I would say this is a miracle which everyone needs to emulate immediately. Just let's go and find out what the hell they're doing to generate these kind of growth rates. But of course, the reason is that all the other, or many of the other indicators just don't square up with this. Certainly if you had 3 years of growth like this, by the way, and these were the 3 years running up to the 2024 election, the incumbent party would have just swept. And the fact that a dominant party that was expected to do very well, in fact, ended up doing less well, is partly because there were all these economic concerns and about unemployment, inflation, and so on. And that's kind of consistent with my view that these numbers were simply not plausible. Because if they were, you'd have had possibly a different election result as well.
So, Arvind, GDP is a national statistic, but India is a federal structure. It has 28 states. What do we miss from this perspective if we look at just the national GDP figure?
Yeah, look, all aggregates hide what's happening underneath them, right? That's true for any aggregate measure. But let me begin by saying the aggregate number is a very useful measure. I mean, aggregate GDP growth rate basically correlates with everything that you care about. Health, education, whatever, poverty reduction, unemployment, et cetera, et cetera. So we must care about the aggregate number as well. In fact, Land Pritchett has shown quite convincingly that a country's per capita GDP is kind of explains almost everything about every social indicator that you care about. So it is a very important number. But it's true that because India is a large country, measuring a nationwide thing is, of course, going to hide a lot of variation that happens, under the surface. And of course, in India, there's a kind of 30, 40-year pattern of consistently diverging performances between what I would call peninsular India, with exceptions both ways. There are one or two peninsular states that don't do well, and there are one or two hinterland states that do very well, like Haryana, for example. But as a broad generalization, the South and the West have done much better than the Hindi heartland and parts of the East. And so, yes, so that's something that, the fact that you study aggregate GDP growth should not, should not prevent us from also studying what's happening at the state level and the regional level. And because there is a consistent pattern of divergence in performance, not just in GDP growth, but across a whole bunch of indicators. So we must look at the states as well, absolutely.
Arvind, whether or not India is the fastest growing economy in the world, it is one of the larger economies in the world today. But some countries with similar GDPs to India will have higher per capita incomes, by which one means in lay people's terms that the average person is earning more than the average person in India might be earning. What does this tell us about the nature of growth in India and the ways in which poverty and growth are intersecting and interacting with one another?
The way my framework for looking at this is what in economic theory we call convergence, which is basically that the poorer you are to start off with, the faster you grow subsequently. I mean, that's the story of countries that have, all the East Asian tigers and many other things. Theory would predict that. It predicts that because the poorer you are, you have cheaper wages, then capital can flow into your country. That raises wages, raises growth. And because capital is flowing from the richer to the poorer parts of the world, the poorer parts of the world will catch up with the richer parts of the world. So that's my kind of broad framework for thinking about this. But of course, in India, related to what I just said earlier, uh, almost precisely the opposite has happened. Performance has not only diverged sharply between southern and western states versus the Hindi hinterland states. It turns out that the southern states are the richer states, and the western states are the richer states. Haryana is a richer state. The richer state, starting off with higher per capita GDP, let's say around 1980 or 1990 or even 2000, they have grown consistently faster than the poorer states. And therefore, what that does is that aggravates regional inequalities, because we think of convergence as a source of equalization. But when stuff like this happens, you get the opposite. And that's why you get, you begin with, different levels of per capita GDP. But because of this pattern of growth, the disparity even widens. And therefore, and that's a troubling pattern, because that means that in India in particular, it's troubling because the poorer parts of India are also the more populous parts of India. So, you're not providing employment opportunities to, the young in the most populous states, basically Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, Madhya Pradesh, Jharkhand, etc. Although Madhya Pradesh in the last 10 years has done reasonably well. So it's very worrying, a worrisome trend, because then it gives rise to all kinds of other pathologies. which we're seeing now, for example, this whole debate on delimitation or also on the Finance Commission. Underlying that is basically divergent economic performance and divergent fertility performance. That's the underlying, and the two are related. Basically fertility follows economic performance. So, the two grievances of the southern states, we did better fertility performance, we're being punished because we're going to lose seats at the delimitation. We've performed better economically, but we're affecting more transfers to the poorer states. So this underlying, divergence of performance in a manner that's worrying and counterintuitive. And even, let me point out, it's even, if you look at China, for example, ever since 1990 and 2000, the pattern has been the poorer states have started catching up with the richer states. Internationally, from 1945 to say 1990, you had the same pattern of divergent performance. But after 1990, even internationally, poorer countries started growing slightly faster than richer countries. But in India, you see exactly the opposite pattern, and with a vengeance. So I think that's the heart of some of the political problems we see today.
Can we next talk about informality? That's one thing that we know about the Indian economy is that over 80% of it is informal. Conventional growth metrics fail to capture this informality. At the same time, there have been various targeted strategies, like the introduction of GST, United Payment Interface, the Universal Identification Cards. Have any of these, to your mind, addressed the issue of informality without affecting livelihoods?
I think there are, many dimensions to that question, right? Let me try to address one or two of them. I mean, one is the obvious fact that demonetization, GST, and COVID were three shocks that disproportionately affected the informal sector. Right, so so the informal sector has been somewhat badly hit because of these three measures. In the case of the GST, the hope was, and I still think the hope is, that it was temporary, that over time there would be greater formalization. So I think the concern with the informal sector in the last 5, 7 years or 8 years is a legitimate one because of all these shocks that have happened. Now, what I would say, of course, is that on the other side, if there's one thing that's been true about India in the last 20 years, ever since UPA2, is that we've done a reasonably good job of building a welfare state. It began with the UPA2, with the Food Security Bill and Manrega. And then also, then under this government is what I call new welfareism, which is, providing cash transfers, providing, cooking gas, power, electricity, bank accounts, toilets. And of course, now you could say this is either a cancer or a cure, the proliferation of cash transfers. So what has happened over the last 20 years, I would say, is that India has built a reasonable welfare state. So at least, in terms of these three shocks that happened, there was some compensation in terms of creating this welfare state, which without doubt has benefited a lot of people. And I would argue, again, relating it back to something else that we spoke about, the fact that overall GDP growth has not been great. I mean, part of the reason why I think we haven't seen a more restive population or a more kind of, mobilizing population is partly this welfare state. I mean, I wrote a piece somewhere saying that this is kind of the quasi-opiate of the masses now, that, this welfare state that we have. So I think, so that's one. The other dimension, which I think is the more long-run thing about the informal sector, is what is our objective for this informal sector, right? I think the fact of informality is a pathology, not some great virtue of the country. Because, if you take, the Chinas, the Koreas, the Taiwans, the Vietnams of the world, I mean, a big part of the progress they've made, the economic development that they've made, is to get people from the informal sector, which is basically low productivity, low wages, low social protection, to more formal sector jobs, etc. And we haven't done a very good job of that. I mean, partly because we haven't been able to create manufacturing jobs like many other countries have. So that's been, I think, one of the long-term failures of the Indian economy. Now, we don't want formalization for the sake of formalization, right? I mean, maybe we do, maybe it is true that, if you get formalized, you will get access to, you will become more visible to the state, both in good and bad ways, but also that, you will become a beneficiary, but maybe there are other consequences as well. So we don't want formalization, just for the sake of formalization. I mean, we want it to reflect the fact that people have better job opportunities and so on, and we haven't succeeded on that. That's a long run failure, which is not any one government's problem. If you look at the the labor force, if you look at the latest even PLFS, I think. I would say even less than 15% are in regular formal sector jobs, regular salaried formal sector jobs. And that's just a failure of our development model, much more broadly. That's why we're not like Vietnam or Korea or Taiwan or whatever. And that's kind of a bigger conversation about why that happened and how it needs to be fixed.
Linked to the pathology of such a large informal sector, Arvind, is the question of underemployment and unemployment. I don't think that we can sidestep that. If you're talking about the future of the Indian economy, 65% of India is under the age of 30. Add to that that the female participation in the labor force is abysmally low in India. This is a large question and perhaps not a fair one to ask in such a short time, but I'd still urge you to consider what it is that we're getting wrong and what can be done.
I think it relates to the previous question about informality. And look, I think the concern is 100% right. That, by the way, when you look at these employment and numbers, I generally don't look at the unemployment numbers. I don't even know what they mean. I think the real thing is, how much employment you're getting in reasonably paid jobs, the kind of formal sector jobs. And that, as we've discussed, is very poor in India, and with no real improvement. Female labor force participation has, there's a huge debate around, how high it is, whether it's gone up or come down. But the point is that, India has done very poorly compared to, even Bangladesh or certainly Vietnam and China and so on. So employment is and opportunities, employment opportunities are basically number one priority in India. There's no question about it. Now, what can be done about it is that there are people who somehow believe that you can generate these employment opportunities without rapid sustained economic growth, that no country in the history of humanity has done that. So I think that we have to generate growth, and we have to, and the failure of the Indian model has been that even when we've had periods of rapid growth, we've not generated employment opportunities, in some large part because our growth has been focused a lot on high skilled services, for example, and that by definition cannot help very many people. So I'm just kind of writing a piece on, so what are the development strategies kind of available to developing countries now, right? Because the only successful model has been the East Asian model, which is basically unskilled labor, manufacturing, exports as a way out of underdevelopment. There's been virtually no other successful model. India hasn't done that. India missed that bus. I do think there are some opportunities to claw back some of that now. We can talk about that later. But basically, if you think that that model is no longer available, then what do you do? I happen to believe that that model is still not fully, but partially available. Um, but then, as you know, there are at least two alternative development models on offer. One, Rohit Lamba and Raghu have said we should focus on IT services and so on. I mean, by definition, you're not going to get inclusion on that. IT services are 5% of the labor force. You're not going to get that. A little bit more interesting, I think Danny Roderick has new ideas on, basically, can you boost the productivity in non-tradable services, like the informal sector? Can we somehow get them to become more productive? Because by definition they'll be more inclusive, because you're affecting the entire population, because the bulk of the population is employed in informal non-tradable services. So somehow if you could get their productivity levels up, maybe you can get both growth and inclusion. I have some reservations about that as well, because the history of by definition, if you have a mom and pop shop, a small shop, there are limits to how much more productive it can be and how productive it can be over time. So there is a kind of we're all scratching our heads as to how to provide this inclusive growth, i.e., employment intensive growth. It's a challenge. My own view is that we still have, if we can get our act together, what has happened in the last 10 years has, given India 1, 2, 3 opportunities to reclaim its manufacturing. And each time we kind of tend to miss the bus. And there's one last shot we have. The state of Tamil Nadu, which I've written about, they've been able to actually get manufacturing, employment-intensive manufacturing into the state. It's never going to be as successful as what the East Asians did, but at least it's going to be something, so I'll give you one statistic. If you look at the global, India's export market share in apparel, it's about 3%. China's was 40%, 45%. Why can't we go from 3 to 10 or 15%? We'll never go to 20%, but, why can't we get, and that means lots of jobs for women, because apparel is very, very female intensive employment. So it does go back to what kind of, what are the broader development strategies that are available which generate employment intensive growth.
There's so much one can follow up with that, but let me move on to asking you something which you're, again, very uniquely placed to answer, which is about India's economic survey. Right? India has always conducted an economic survey right since 1951 to coincide with the annual budget. You did 3 very fine ones while you were chief economic advisor. Um, Looking at the 2025 economic survey, a lot of people here, it's out. We wanted to ask you, how should one read the survey? What are the things we should be looking out for? This year's economic survey, what does it tell us that other indicators don't? Can you speak to, is it revealing things that other indicators are concealing and so on? Can you throw some light on that, please?
No, see, I think the economic survey is one of those funny beasts that there is an obligation, almost like it's actually the only job that a chief economic advisor is obliged to do, is to produce this economic survey just before the budget. That's the only requirement. The rest is all what you make of it. Now, there have been different approaches to this economic survey. I think most of my predecessors, it's fair to say, or the tradition used to be that it's kind of just a recording of what's been happening in the economy in the previous 12 months and maybe before or whatever, right? So it is like a review of the economy with maybe a little bit of analysis thrown in. Of course, as you know, I mean, when I came, I decided to make it completely different and make it a kind of analytical document with discussing lots of policy issues, do a lot more new research and so on. Um, so that's very much, depends on the incumbent on what they do. And so it's not meant to be either revelatory about things that, is somehow otherwise hidden or whatever. It's just, it just kind of reflects what the incumbent wants to do. And but I do think that surveys can shed light on important things. For example, I think the recent survey was, I think, noteworthy for a couple of things. I think the big pitch of this survey was deregulation, and how do you declog the regulatory cholesterol in the system, which I think was a very useful and very very important and very useful contribution to the ongoing policy discussions this year. And also, I think that it put forward a point of view which is, very interesting and very necessary, saying that, we do need to be much more open to trade and FDI with China than our geopolitical stance might otherwise allow. So these were, I think, two good ideas that were in the most recent survey. And so, it's like ideas like this can come out of any survey depending upon what the incumbent chooses to do.
We've been talking about deregulation for longer than perhaps I've been on this earth. But I wanted to invite you to talk a little bit more about, you were talking about the manufacturing sector and the fact that we may have missed the big bus, but we still have an opportunity to, to bring up the manufacturing sector a little bit. Could you talk a little bit about what steps can be taken in that direction? And what do you make of the health of the services sector and the agricultural sector as well?
Oh God, that's the whole economy. Fixing services. So let's talk about the manufacturing for a second, right? Look, when India missed the manufacturing bus, but around the time of the global financial crisis, what happened was that China started, which, around the time of the global financial crisis was when China, it just dominated the global market in manufacturing, just dominated it, at least in the sectors that we could potentially compete in, right? But after the global financial crisis, it started becoming, for very organic reasons, because labor-intensive sectors require cheap wages, and as you develop, as China was doing so rapidly, wages were rising rapidly. So it was actually vacating some of that manufacturing and export space to other developing countries, which was a kind of organic phenomenon. That was the first opportunity for India, so, say between the global financial crisis and 2017, 18. And Soumitra Chatterjee and I calculated that we benefited very little from that. Most of it went to Vietnam, ASEAN countries, Indonesia. Then the second opportunity came along with, I would say, the Trump geopolitical shock, when China became the target of a lot of Western action. And then foreign capital then said, we do need to look for long-term alternatives in investment destination to China. And then, to some extent, there's at least one or two examples where that actually played out. Was Apple. Apple basically, around the time of the Trump shock and thereafter, started looking seriously at alternatives to China. And Apple has come to India. It's doing quite well in India, but Apple is an exception. The electronic sector has an exception to the otherwise, bleak picture. So if you leave aside Apple, the second shock also didn't lead to very much, with the small exception of Tamil Nadu, which, we can speak about. Now, the third opportunity has come along because, now the Trump tariffs, I mean, we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, day after, this complete uncertainty. But I think one can be confident, or not confident, no confidence here. It's looking more likely that China will be further targeted, and some of the East Asian countries might be. And these are all competitors to India. So there's no doubt that there will be a further stampede of capital out of these countries. So that's the third opportunity now that we have. Now, what do we need to do to take advantage of this? So, you know, all the things we did not do right over the last 40 years, in some ways we need to start making amends. To be fair to the government, they did start this subsidy scheme to try and attract this investment. But I think fundamentally, this is what, I've said this elsewhere to, in my podcast with Martin Wolf and so on, that I think that investors want minimal risk. You can give them corporate tax cuts, you can give them subsidies, maybe that helps. But I think what they're really looking for is minimal risk. And my only observation, which is a bit controversial, is that all that the government is doing on the political side, the weaponization of enforcement, the arbitrariness, the favoring of some, big businesses over others, the fact that there's a lot of tax harassment, the regulatory, overzealousness on the regulatory front. These are things that actually really raise risks to investors. So all the manifestations on the political side have counterparts on the economic side. And that's why you see the last 3-4 years, foreign direct investment has been declining in India, and private investment is basically flat. Now, it's a puzzle because you say, oh, India is growing rapidly, they're making a lot of profits, then why aren't they investing, So it seems like, and even in the last 3 months, the number of, cases against a lot of companies, the extent of, tax arrest. And of course, in the last 2 years, and I've spoken about this, you talk about deregulation. In fact, we've gone in the other direction in terms of these absolutely crazy quality control orders that are now being imposed, which is like really taking India back on the trade side to the quota license Raj of the 70s and 80s. Now every import now has to pass a quality standard determined domestically, and this is just a paradise for protectionist politicians, bureaucrats who want to, really meddle in the minutiae, and get thrills or power out of it, and crony capitalism. So it's a coming together of this, and this is going. And I mean, there are stories galore of how stuff is lying in the ports because companies haven't received these clearances. So we're kind of going in the opposite direction, and so you combine what I've said about the style of governance on the political side. Those are pretty much the same manifestations on the economic side, and this is not conducive to attracting investment. Not just foreign but also domestic. I mean, the regulatory favors that some businesses receive affects domestic businesses as much as foreign businesses. So it's not a favoring of all domestic business. So I think unless we can really, and I think Tamil Nadu has done a good job on that in really kind of creating a climate where business, once it comes in, it can be somewhat reassured that all actors will work to kind of minimize and troubleshoot together, as it were. That it's not that business will not be left on its own and will have to cope with all the cope both with a capricious state and with other actors. So the state needs to be both not weaponizing its enforcement and not being arbitrary, but it also needs to be a good interlocutor when it comes to labor disputes, for example. It has to be kind of labor, capital, and the state coming together, and that's been happening in Tamil Nadu as well, where there are labor strikes and they all come together and sort it out. So so the thing is that when people say what India needs to do, it's not any one thing or any one policy lever that you can push. It's this broader climate of minimizing risk, which needs to be addressed. And if your political instincts are in one direction, it's hard to convince investors that somehow you're going to be very different in terms of the conditions for doing business.
I know you didn't want to. I know you pointed out that that's the whole of the economy. If I'm also asking about the services and agricultural sector, and I completely appreciate that we can't unpack all of that in great detail. But any trends from these two sectors that you would like to draw our attention to?
Well, see, on services, I think in the last 3, 4 years, we've done really well on these global capability centers. There's no question that, we had the first wave of, the back office, and all of that in the 90s and 2000s. And now, we've done well in building these global capability centers where, more and more of a lot of the analysis, the back office stuff is being done for all the major countries in the world. It's being done so the services and global capability center revolution is one of the really bright spots. But again, as you know, it can only lift the fortunes of, a small portion of the labor force. I mean, there'll be some kind of trickle down effects, but those are trickles. They're not the real thing. Agriculture, I'm not an expert on agriculture, but I do think there's a long-term issue here that in the context of climate change, see, firstly, agriculture is, riddled with bad policies, absolutely riddled with bad policies. And this is something that, one needs to point out that many of these bad policies are not just the central government, but, state governments are responsible for many of these bad policies. Like, the power subsidy for agriculture, free power, is very much a state policy pathology, not a central government pathology. So, quite apart from fixing some of these things, I think the longer term question is, how do you get, in the context of climate change and things, how do you get more rapid productivity growth in agriculture, which can again benefit farmers as a whole? And they don't have to be reliant just on subsidies and so on. Because the truth is that being a farmer is not very remunerative in India. That's the truth. I mean, apart from the top 5% or whatever, it's not by the way, that's true world over, by the way, but in India, it's complicated by the fact that you have too many people in agriculture, so agriculture just cannot sustain this. And in the US and places, the only reason it's better is because, the workforce in agriculture is now a minuscule fraction of what it used to be. So we need to get people out of agriculture, where we've not been successful because we haven't created manufacturing opportunities. But, we do need to, raise, the resilience of agriculture, the productivity in agriculture. How do you also, use less fertilizer, which has been so damaging? Of course, the water tables are depleting in so many parts of northern India because of all these power subsidies and things. And the most you've mentioned that you've done this podcast. Collateral damage from that is also the pollution that we see in Delhi, for example, and in other parts of India. So agriculture is really is something that we certainly should not neglect. Absolutely, we get taken in with services and manufacturing and things, but as long as so many people live in agriculture, as long as the basic remuneration of being a farmer is pretty slim, whether it requires more R&D, whether it requires, all kinds of things. And of course, one controversial thing I will say about agriculture is that we've gotten too distracted by, the kind of old political issues around this, and we need some fresh thinking on agriculture, really. How do you develop resilient, productive agriculture is, I think, the long-term challenge.
Just on agriculture, Arvind, if I may, I mean, because I've been studying with paddy farmers for over 25 years, think about this a lot. One thing that we have seen in India is that the structural reform that happens of people coming out of agriculture are not going into manufacturing or any other kind of industrial work. They're going into construction work, right? So it is actually more precarity. And we saw with the pandemic this backward flow into rural India that hasn't fully reversed yet. And this issue that you raise about climate change and agriculture is absolutely key. I mean, and India really has to take the lead on it, it seems, because if we don't have crop diversity and this over reliance on producing too much paddy and too much wheat, we are going to actually exacerbate the problem, which is already acute. I mean, the Green Revolution has turned a brown revolution in more parts of the country than we care to know. But if I may now just turn to thinking about um, investments and current investment in infrastructure and human capital, because there is one view that says the government expenditure, there's been fiscal consolidation really through expenditure cuts. So are the cuts in happening in infrastructure and human capital development? None of the successful economies that you've mentioned, whether it's Vietnam, Korea, South Korea, China, have managed to do well without these basic investments in infrastructure and human capital development. What is the story in India on this?
I mean, this is one of the big themes of the book Devesh and I have written,
Great.
How historically, what our priorities have been and, how we've neglected, especially health and education. I think on public infrastructure, I think we're finally catching up. I think in the last 10 years, 15 years, actually since the late 1990s, our infrastructure has, improved tremendously. Anyone who's lived and traveled in India circa 1990 and 2025, there's a huge difference in our infrastructure. There's, whether it's roads or even the rural roads, airports, ports, just day and night difference. I think the still lingering and really devastating pathology is still health and education. And now, look, I think there's a big historical trajectory to this, which all of us know. The only two things I will say, which are again, I think, just food for thought, is that there's a tendency to blame the central government, one, and to blame it for not providing enough resources. And, maybe there's merit in that. But I think the question that we don't honestly ask ourselves is, education and health are all constitutionally state subjects. Why is it that 28 or whatever, 20, beginning, whatever, 5, 10, 15, 20, 28 states, apart with of course, notable exceptions like Kerala, Tamil Nadu, and then maybe Himachal Pradesh more recently, why is it that systematically our state governments never found political opportunity in providing good health and education? And I think the Indian society at some level is deeply culpable for this. I think Indian politics is deeply culpable. And state governments are deeply culpable as well. So I think what was interesting about the Aam Aadmi Party experiment was, for the first time, we saw, at least under version 1, that they actually made health and education a kind of politically salient issue. Of course, subsequently everything changed, but at least it showed that if you could, and you could make the case, this will be contested, you could make the case that in the first time they got re-elected for having delivered on some of these health and education promises. But we don't find that anywhere, not in many other places. Of course, Kerala and Tamil Nadu are exceptions. But the question we should ask ourselves is, why didn't West Bengal, Communist Party, supposedly thing over decades never focused on health and education? And let me make it even more controversial by saying that, what I think progressives, are also not willing to see here is that whatever the improvements in education that happened, which is what Devesh and I document in our book, happened in large part because of economic growth. It's economic growth that changed the dynamic of, acquiring education in India. And so, it's kind of a long story that there are many, many perpetrators in this. but we always tend to point fingers at the central government for not providing resources, and I think that's a very small part of this for our deficiency. And by the way, I don't really see, developments that will make one hopeful. If you look at even apart from the last ASER report, if you look at the previous 20 ASER education reports, learning has stagnated in school for a long, long time. So it's not as if one can say, wow, now there are, changes afoot which are going to dramatically alter this.
We can't talk about government expenditure and investment without talking about fiscal deficit position. Essentially, is a phenomena that refers to the government having to spend or spending more than the revenue it's earning, and debt, which is government borrowing from internal and external sources, whether it's the central government or the state government. When you look at our fiscal deficit and debt numbers, what do you make of them? Does that concern you at all?
Yeah, definitely. I think that, what we've learned, I guess, in terms of broader macroeconomics, is that macroeconomic stability is absolutely essential for anything that you have to do. Countries that are in crisis, that are perennially vulnerable, don't get to, make a lot of huge amount of progress. So yes, broadly, I think India's success, comparatively and relatively speaking, is that, over 75 years, we've done reasonably well on macroeconomic stability. There is some inbuilt, whatever you may call it, the system, that we haven't had very high inflation. We've had governments that are largely responsible and so on. But some of that is changing now, and I think that competitive populism, for example, between the states, now everyone is rushing to give cash transfers and stuff like that, and so fiscal positions have deteriorated, everywhere, central government and state government. So we need to fix that. Because part of the reason we've gotten away with it is because we've had reasonably good growth. And when you're growing, generally, people think that this is a country that's going to be able to generate resources and, whatever, will have the resources to finance these things. But the problem is that if there's a downturn, or if India's long-run growth rate starts tanking down, then I think we do have too much debt and too high deficits. And we need to start, it's not a panic, but we need to start gradually addressing that. And it has to be done at the level of the state government and the central government. But it's easier to say that because when you look at many of these state governments, for example, not only have they been running up all these deficits and debt, they've been doing it very non-transparently, lots of off-budget stuff and so on. And really, again, one is tempted to think that, the central government should impose all this under the, FRBM. We had all these limits on what state governments could do. I mean, that works up to a point. But then state governments turn around and say, who are you to discipline us when you're so indisciplined yourself? Those kinds of things happen. But again, I think it's a bit like health and education that, unless we kind of believe in the virtue of some kind of stability and responsibility, competitive populism will always take us in the other direction. So it's something that really we need to be careful about.
An interesting thing you just said, Arvind, was that, when there are high growth rates, which India has at the moment officially, people have resources. And yet at the moment, we know that household debt in India and the decline of household savings is a serious issue. How does one square these two? How can you have a high growth rate and this very significant increase in household debt? How does it
You know how I reconcile it? I don't, in fact, to me, the savings and thing is evidence that growth rates are not high. So for me, it's easy to square. In the last, whatever, many 5-10 years, growth has not been as high, employment has not been as good as we've had these shocks, COVID, etc. And that's why savings are down, because incomes are down, and it's as simple as that. So for me, there's no great, a paradox here. It's only a puzzle and a paradox for those who keep insisting that growth rates are so high, because then that begs the question of, well, how do you explain these precarious household finances?
Arvind, you spoke about the opportunity that India might have in the tariff wars that have been triggered by Trump in America. But you also acknowledge that the world is very uncertain right now. And in that context, I wanted to ask you about how resilient you think we are to the turbulence that's going on in geopolitics, and what role can foreign policy play in influencing our growth?
Look, I think, as countries go, we are not, we're not hugely vulnerable for reasons that we may not be growing as gangbusters, but broadly the macro situation is reasonable. We're getting a modicum of growth, not spectacular. So I think we're not in a bad position, but the truth is, if the economy, global economy heads south, it's going to affect us as well. And then the question is then, what do we have resilience to counter that? And I do think we have resilience to counter that. We can spend more. The RBI can cut rates. Our welfare state is reasonably, free food, etc. These are things we shouldn't forget. Are cushions and stuff that provides resilience. Can we shape the global geopolitics? To some extent, we can. I think the trick is to understand, we should not get too delusionally self-important, nor should we kind of think that, everything is done outside. I think this kind of balance of realizing that we're neither too important nor important enough, one of these middle powers. And I think that as a middle power, we have agency to act with other countries to create a system that, is going to be beneficial for us and everyone else. Generally, I think our foreign policy, to be fair, has not been unreasonable at all. Maybe there are pockets where it could be better, but I think on balance, we've done reasonably well. We have navigated some of these turbulent times. The war, the Ukraine war, the tariff thing. Broader geopolitics, China. I'm not an expert on diplomacy and things. It's inherently quite difficult, but we've not done too badly. And I think that as long as this operates out of a realistic assessment of our capability and the realistic assessment of our what we can do and cannot do internationally, is this. But I will just end by saying that, Vijay Kelkar, one of India's wisest statesmen, has always said, the best foreign policy is 10% economic growth. And I think if we can have a resilient economy, a growing economy providing jobs, I think I kind of completely agree with Vijay Kelkar that, your options and what you can do, your leverage, your influence, your vulnerability are all much better if you're a more resilient, growing, inclusive economy.
Before we let you go, Arvind, though that began to sound like an excellent peroration, we can't let you go before asking you about your quite robust criticism of the central bank's exchange rate policy. Should we be worried about the falling value of the rupee? And is monetary policy here important for, again, we're thinking about growth, does it have a role to play, especially in today's Trump's world?
Look, Mike, me and my co-authors, our criticism of the central bank related to a 2.5 year period when we felt that the exchange rate was kept too uncompetitive. In the last 2, 3 months, that's changed because the dollar has been declining. So, in some sense, India has kind of escaped some of the financial pressure and things. But I think the broader issue here, broadly monetary policy, I think we do a reasonably good job. I don't think we have, but we did seriously go wrong on managing our exchange rate policy in the last 2.5 years. But the broader issue there is that if we want to be an exporting economy, uh, we want an exchange rate that supports that. But the balance of political economy in India is always against the exporting interest. I mean, exporting interests just do not have enough say in shaping policy more broadly, and especially exchange rate policy. I think that's a deeper problem with the Indian political system, that we don't have enough countervailing voices on the export side and what it requires and what the consequences of that are, whether it be a competitive exchange rate, whether it be access to inputs at international prices, whether it be deregulation, whatever. I think the exporting interests are are not represented enough in our policy making calculations.
Thank you so much, Arvind, for your time and for these insights. It's been very clarifying for us, and I'm pretty sure it will be very clarifying for our audience as well. For those of you listening in to us, if you like this episode, please support our work. Please share this podcast with like minded listeners, and don't forget to subscribe. Until next time, goodbye.